Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name's Kate. I'm a technical writer. I create technical and user documentation of various shapes and forms, voice and tone. I collaborate on content strategy across startup, agile, waterfall, and basically whatever works processes. These days, I'm working with remote, mostly culturally diverse teams on high-scale projects that usually require tons of short and long-term planning. And while switching more and more to full-time remote work, I'm doing it side by side with my sidekick researcher, Ripley. You can see a photo of him attempting to conduct a peer review. And if you've ever seen movies Alien or Aliens, you can probably figure out the inspiration behind the name. So today I'd like to talk about some pains and gains of planning a content strategy while collaborating with teams of developers, designers, product owners, and other contributors and stakeholders within your team and teams across your company or organization. I'll focus on some pitfalls that might lie ahead when you don't plan your teamwork, even if it feels like you're a standalone content creator, and then talk about the workarounds and best practices that work for my team to make the big picture come together without missing out on any details throughout the planning and implementation process. So let's get into it. So when I started working on this presentation, I have already been collaborating with distributed teams for a few years, and I feel like a lot of us experienced remote work in some shape or form over the past few months. So based on my observations, I concluded that you could work from anywhere or almost anywhere, provided stable and secure Wi-Fi, and still plan and execute your content strategy and work effectively with the team if you establish clear communications as early as possible. Very preferably before you take off with your content strategy roadmap. Sometimes communications work and processes run smoothly, and sometimes you'll need to touch base more than once before you define your starting points, any misconceptions or potential planning pitfalls, and then figure out the workarounds, implementation, and your overall delivery process. So before you start working on the grand plan, it's really helpful in the long run to establish clear communications as your starting point and have regular open channels of communication to touch base that you're all on the same page about your goals. Assume less, double check, and communicate more. Define your peers, stakeholders, decision makers, and key contacts. And whatever system works best for your team and company, use it regularly so that you are all kept accountable. Applying these practices will save you lots of time and energy and help prevent things going off the rails and destroy whatever original plan you have in mind for your content strategy and roadmap. When we work on something long and hard enough, we might develop certain biases that somewhat affect the overall planning and implementation process. Based on the pains and gains that I've encountered, I've put together some potential planning gaps to avoid when you work on the content strategy. So one of them would be putting the end result as the highest priority over details and the other way around. One of the things that I've seen happen is when you look at a content strategy and plan it without considering all the pieces that need to come together in order to reach the end goal. So you look at where you are and where you need to be, and you put that end result as the highest priority. What might happen in this case is that you don't consider all the little pieces that need to come together and that are in between. The other side of that is focusing too much on the details, trying to make everything perfect. Then you risk ending up in a vicious circle of reviews, rewrites, and not planning resources properly. When creating content and trying to make it as unique and appealing as possible, let's not forget about its practical side and purpose. Generally, people want to understand and get a use out of the information and not just marvel at our language skills or marketing techniques. Another thing is letting your content strategy encompass one department or one type of content. Another common case I've seen is when content strategy kind of just encompasses one department or one type of content and doesn't really look at the organization's content as a whole, doesn't look at the future end goal of getting all that content aligned. It then shuts out a lot of other opportunities and areas that need to be addressed. Like, for example, making sure that the company's branding and target audience are taken into consideration and that everyone is consistent across their messaging. A lot of it boils down to just different groups really not collaborating with each other, and so that when happens, then of course they don't plan together and they don't make sure that they're coming up with one kind of comprehensive content strategy. Another important thing that is worth mentioning is lack of impact and involvement. Sometimes it's really difficult to get out of that stuck mentality of not being able to move forward because you're might not getting the budget that you need or access to people you need to talk to. And it can almost be frustrating. So it's important to be able to make sure that you have the means of communicating up to someone who can make an executive decision to say, we know that we have a focus on these three other things, but this is still a priority project. So let's make sure we have some time and resources allocated to keeping this moving forward. Your content strategy might not be all project that the company is worried about. But when you can at least make sure that you have the ability to keep it moving forward and not letting it stagnate can really help. And last but not least that I wanted to mention, which I think is a huge deal, is overlooking allocation of resources. Allocating resources is one of the biggest issues that can backfire and can also lead to situations where you can end up in hurry up and wait mode. If you don't plan for what's up front of you and just make a project as you go, just following your inspiration or the initial plan that you had laid out, or targeting that final release date, then what often happens is it just never gets done because you did not consider the time and efforts of other team members involved, and maybe your own as well. Sometimes something else always comes up and that's more important or more pressing. And if you haven't thought about what resources you want to put forward and towards this, then it's never going to happen. I think that's also true if you don't really have smaller deadlines, if you don't decomposition your tasks or schedule in your plan that you're working towards. And then those things, not having a set schedule and not having resources allocated, often can just stop a project in its track and delay it for weeks or even months. So now that we've talked about the possible pitfalls, let's focus on the bright side and what would be a good idea to incorporate into the planning and execution process when it comes to putting together a complex content strategy. I think tying everything back to your business goals means taking a closer look into what stands behind those goals. A lot of companies have mission and vision statements in some shape or form, but it doesn't hurt to dig deeper. So given the statements that are out there, what are the goals from the business side as far as how we are going to make that mission a reality and make that vision come true and convey it clearly to our audience? I think everything has to hinge on those business goals, or else things can easily get sidetracked and can end up not following the strategy that you've set forward to achieve. I think it's really important to think about how your strategy is going to get you both short and long-term wins and address business goals that are more immediate versus ones that are more out there in the future. So an example of that might be you have some really pressing delivery need that's a short-term goal, but then maybe you've got a long-term plan to deliver content into other markets to a larger customer base, and so that might involve something like localization. In such conflicting or overlapping cases, it's important to think about what are the short-term business goals that we have maybe within the next 6 months to a year versus ones that are more like 2-3 years down the road. So it's important to think about not just what's going to happen immediately when you put this plan in place, but also what's going to happen down the road, so that your strategy can address and encompass all of that. And it really helps to make it a public knowledge within your team and company, and make sure that it's common knowledge that these are some of the wins that you're looking for in short term and long term. Try to address them and treat them as milestones within your project plan. So this way, you know that within 6 weeks, let's say, you're supposed to have a new localization management system chosen and have a test environment set up so that you could start playing with it and seeing how your content needs to fit into it, or how it needs to be modified to handle some of the content decisions that you've made. Another thing that I want to bring up is budgeting and figuring out what your return on investment is when you're coming up with your strategy. Besides editing and publishing tools, you also have to budget your time, and it's super important. It bears repeating. That's not only the project timeline, but it's the time of every single person devoting efforts to the project. I think that the time and the resources as elements of budget often get overlooked, or they don't get really accounted for. It can be difficult if you haven't been tracking the way you've been using your time and resources, and it can be difficult to even estimate how much might be involved in that project. But it's really important to consider that and put that into your plan as much as possible and as accurately as possible, so that you don't run into nasty surprises when it comes to actually putting that new strategy in place. Strategy implementation is as important as planning. Your content strategy alone isn't the full scope of a plan, because you also, once you've got that strategy in place, need a plan for as you implement each part of it, how the process is going to go. Think about the logistics of that strategy and making sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. Think of it as moving from a strategic point to a tactical point of view. Because strategy is all well and good, but it's not going to get things done. It might be able to identify and reserve the funds and people that you need, but now that you have all that, that's where your strategy pretty much ends. It serves as a roadmap during all of this other tactical work that needs to get done, but your strategy is there to get everything rolling, to get approval and say, yes, this is how we're going to do things. This is all the things that we need. And now that we have it, now we have to actually do the stuff, do the work, and implement our vision. So we've already scratched the surface about evaluating the scope and prioritizing short and long-term goals. And that really speaks to the scheduling aspects of being able to put together that timeline and identify not only what the big pieces are that need to happen, but also, in order for these big pieces to happen, what's the order in which they're going to happen? Then you can start looking at each one and start scoping each one of them individually. I think that's where it really becomes important to have deadlines and a schedule set up, and to try to stick to that as best as possible. Then if things slip off schedule, keep open communications so that you can let other people know who may be affected. Let's say this didn't go how we thought it would. Instead of taking 12 weeks, maybe now it's going to take 15, or maybe we finish this piece early so that can get something else moving. But I think it's important that if you don't set deadlines for yourself and have those goals in place, then a lot of times things will just drag on forever. You really need to not only have those deadlines in place, but know who's going to work on each piece, when they're going to be available, how that factors into other projects that they may be working on. It's a lot of moving pieces and parts for the content strategy itself, but also for all the people who are going to be working on it with their own other work on the side. So that's where that planning really, really becomes essential. One other piece I want to mention, because I've seen it getting ignored a lot, is building in time for quality assurance. So things like taking the time for a content review before you build your content and putting it out there for everyone to see. Making sure that the steps were laid out for our users actually work. Things like setting up test environments and allowing time for user feedback. That's where I've seen the projects get hung up just because when they were doing their resource allocation or planning, people just oftentimes didn't think about how much time really is involved in quality assurance. So I think that's one thing that I really wanted to bring up as an important part to include in your final delivery and implementation stage. You have to make sure that everyone who's responsible for doing that level of testing or quality assurance, or whoever is the next in the chain of delivering the content, are aware that something is coming, and not just wait until whatever the thing is you're working on is done to throw it at them and say, okay, we did a thing, now go test it. Make sure that your test engineers and peers are involved, or at least knowledgeable of what you're doing along the way, so they know what to expect when the time comes for them to start kicking the tires. I think the only other thing to really mention is that you need to be mindful about what you're doing, about how what you're doing is going to impact the work of other groups, departments, and other teams. You can't just assume that they're going to play ball when you start rolling out a new strategy. Make sure that you're not only on board in theory, but that they are pretty much committed to the success of the project, and they should have a stake in it in some form as well. So let's say the technical communication group is implementing the strategy. So therefore, they should be reaching out to their tech support, salespeople, marketing, and to say, hey, we have this thing that we are doing. It's going to impact you all in some way or another, and you can benefit from it. So let's come together and make sure that this thing is going to be a solution that works for everybody. Another thing that I wanted to mention is identifying dependencies. Be able to look at projects and ask yourself, okay, what can be isolated? What is something that isn't tied specifically to a dependency down the road? It might be initial conversion of your content. It might be doing a content audit to at least get your arms around. What do we have to do to deal with it? Even if we don't have the resources to do anything with it, what are we looking at here? What's the total scope? And what are the types of things that we need to be changing? Something small on that scale can still keep the project going as you wait for other pieces to start moving. So identifying dependencies is useful, especially when the resources or the budget might be very stretched. You want to be able to say, we know that we can do each piece at a time and not feel like we're biting off more that we can chew. And last but not least, I think it's really helpful along those lines is the idea of doing a pilot project or proof of concept, because that can really help you look at sort of a small but essential piece of your strategy and see how that works. And then you can look at what does go wrong or what goes kind of in an unexpected direction during the pilot. Then you can use that to kind of help plan out your larger implementation more thoroughly, but without having invested everything up front. You can kind of see if something is going to go not quite according to the plan, what kind of things those might be by doing a pilot. And then you can say, oh, okay, here's how we need to course correct before we go forward to the rest of this and sort of expand it further. So that's pretty much it from my side for today. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you find the takeaways useful and applicable. Keep up those communications going. Feel free to reach out, and hopefully we'll see each other next year, not only online and remote, but in person, and continue changing the world one piece of content at a time. Thanks, guys.
I think we'll get started with some of the Q&A, although I think we have plenty of time, so there's no rush. Courtney had asked a question back in the stage chat about whether you find it counterproductive or problematic if your documentation isn't the same tone as the marketing site or the blog.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And I think a lot of times it comes down to identifying your audience. That would be the first step. And just figuring out that you're at least on the same page with your overall style guide across your company and organization, because at the end of the day, your marketing materials or blog posts cannot differ that drastically from what you're putting into your internal content. Because even the most technical documentation that you're working on with your teams, it cannot be super drastic, or I don't think it should be, at least. It shouldn't be super dramatically different from your external content that you are putting for other users. Yep.
I have a question. Is this what people refer to when they say single sourcing?
I think so.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
That's still new to me. Okay.
Okay. It's
information.
Yeah, it's. I think it's never-ending process of getting to know things and just see if they work for your specific teams and for products. So, yep.
Cool. Going back to our list of questions from the stage chat, Catherine had asked, can there be a content strategy only for technical documentation?
Yeah, I actually saw that question, and it's also a good one. I think at the moment, one of the projects that I'm closely involved in is working on mostly technical documentation. So at first there was minimum UI, UX writing, and most of the content that me and the team are working on are developer guides, APIs. So we're mainly focusing on what and when we want to put out, when it's going to be released, and some projects may require only technical side to cover, may only require covering just the technical side. and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no user facing with external users, but they're also not. But they're also users in terms of tech support or developers. So there are no marketing materials or no blog posts that you're going to involve, and you're mainly working on your APIs and just trying to get the grip and scope of what you're going to be covering in terms of your development process. So I believe the answer is yes, it is possible, and some such cases do exist.
Yay. It's kind of a happy story. On that note, Victor mentioned that a lot of people, and I feel the same way, that we were all pretty impressed with the graphics in your talk. Oh, we lost video. Okay.
Okay, sorry. Again, a few technical difficulties.
No, we're one. Yeah. Okay.
It happens. It's been on production, so
it's meant. Yeah, that's what happens. Yeah, in production.
Keep going.
Live. Okay. Yeah, I was talking about the graphics that a lot of people were really impressed and amazed by. Victor had asked if you could tell us what tools you used to make them.
Yeah, so some of them were tailored for the presentation, but I used a few resources like Flaticon and FreePic. It's a huge; those are huge storages and databases of graphics on various topics and matters. And if you really dig deep and dive into your research, you can find lots of cool stuff for any kinds of presentations. So feel free to use it.
Nice. That's all pretty new to me too. I was looking for a note on my desk here because my friend Sarah here in the US had mentioned something called Undraw. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it sounds like there are just a lot of libraries out there.
Yeah, so yeah, there are more and more of those, and they do make life easier for sure. And they're good when you don't have like lots of time on your hands, but you still want to be creative and to find something unique to put into your presentation. So it's always good to have that as a backup plan.
Makes sense to me. Looking at some other questions, I think Esty had asked here in our session. She's asking about planning strategy. I'll just read what she wrote. Planning strategy includes the tools and processes that you're implementing. Does planning strategy include the tools and processes that you're implementing, or how you get to that plan, or all of the above?
I believe it comes to mix and matching, unless you have some strict procedures within your company or organization. If you have some like defined guidelines on how to work on those things, but the good thing I think that we can use as writers, as content creators and developers, is to tailor the best pieces and tools that work for us in a short and long-term perspective. And it's a good thing to be able to see the pros and cons of any tool or process, and be able to make your point with your team, like why it's good and okay to use this or that. If it doesn't sound all that conventional, by the end of the day, if it works for your product, for your team, why don't you can use it. Like if it's a set of processes or any kind of tools. So I think the answer would be all of the above, but it depends on each case, on each product, and on your end users, and how fast do you want to put your strategy together and start implementing it.
On that note, we've got a follow-up question from Esty, I think, about people processes. So the question is, do your teams or you on a team of one have access to project management planning as part of your development?
Yeah. If we're talking about like more conventional tools or processes like maybe Jira or any methodologies like Scrum or Kanban, I've used those, I think mostly all of the time, working on different projects within different companies, whether startup or bigger companies with more high-scale, complex projects. So it's, as a technical writer and within Tech Writers team, I do have access to those tools, and I strongly encourage everyone to get on board, because you keep an eye on and you're on track with all the project activities and developments, and you're never left behind. And you integrate your writing process and your planning process within the development process. And I think it's better to do it earlier rather than later, because I think it should never be an afterthought, like covering the product with supplementing content. So it shouldn't be an afterthought, and you should be totally included in the team processes from the get-go.
Yes, I agree.
And also, yeah, and as a one of the takeaways and follow-ups that I wanted to add, that working on content strategy and implementing it, if you're not a software developer, but you're dealing with content, in any case, it's a team effort and team sport. And the more people are on board with your ideas and plans, and the more hold you get on the processes, the better. So I'm also looking at some questions, and
sorry, I forgot I was muted. I
oh, you were saying,
yeah.
Sorry, I was looking at your awesome nail polish, so I didn't realize.
Distraction. I do have a couple questions from Ashley, but her first question from a little while back was, what are some techniques to facilitate coherent and effective communication across teams? So, for example, do you have big meetings? Do you use Slack channels? And she goes on to say, even if we all agree in theory to a certain way of doing things, it's hard to keep track of what everybody's really doing. Yes, especially when plans change for one team or another.
Oh, yes, that can be, yeah. And if you add different time zones to the mix, different stakeholders, a lot of things can go wrong. And yeah, so what you can do is, maybe it sounds a bit like too obvious, but trust me, when it comes to real life, it's still something that people used to forget. Keeping regular touch base meetings, like not just sprint reviews if you're working with agile methodologies. Yes, use the tools that work for your team, Jira, Asana, any other. I know some teams that use Trello for tracking their Kanban tasks. Try to split the tasks and into smaller chunks and pieces to make the progress more visible, and to make progress tracking more easy. But basically, yeah, if you're working on site in an office or remotely, try to communicate as much as possible, but in a healthy way. Like, don't bombard each other with follow-up questions every half an hour. That's of course going to be distracting, but yeah, set up a schedule, recurring meetings, and touch up base to make sure constantly that you're all on the same page. And you can use what works for me and my teams, no matter the company, are where Slack channels and decomposing tasks. But don't get too. But there's a fine line, because sometimes you would hear, especially from developers, that there are too many communication channels. Like, keep that sweet spot of balance. Like, don't have 5 meetings a week. Just try to find that balance that works for everyone, and try to approach everyone and all tasks with a human touch. Like, just make sure you're clear. Everyone is able to bring down something to the table, and they're comfortable in translating that and conveying.
Makes sense. Yes to everything you said. I guess it's especially hard since we are all working remotely, but it is just keep talking to people.
Yeah, and I would really encourage people to use to switch on their cameras during work meetings, because I know some teams that really execute that well. They have work meetings and more chill after hours meetings still remotely. But one of the teams that I worked with and collaborated with, there was only 2 people who would switch on their cameras, and we would see that they're real people, and you're in touch with your team members. Because trust me, sometimes it gets so frustrating, because you feel like you're a standalone warrior, and you're not in sync with your team or who's on doing what. And it's not about, like, my background is not work appropriate. It just comes to disconnection between team members, which consequently may affect your overall results in a negative way.
Yeah, I feel like this is a whole conversation we could spend hours on. Because I think I do generally prefer to see people's faces and to show my face. But since we have been working remotely for so long, for the past several months, there's a lot of fatigue as well with looking at the screen. And, it's also nice to just try to understand somebody by hearing their voice and really listening to the things they're saying. But this is
exactly.
It's a person by person or team by team thing, I guess.
Agreed.
We do have quite a bit of time left, although I think it's just 5 minutes before our next speaker begins, but I'll keep rolling with the questions. We've got quite a few left, which is awesome.
If there are any, I'm happy to.
Yeah, keep pasting them if you like, people, into the chat. Kat had asked a little while ago about what exactly QA entailed in your strategy.
I was referring to quality assurance and testing. And although you may have test engineers or quality assurance team who is a separate team, but I've noticed that as a writer and content strategy planner, you're most of the time the last one standing, and you'll be the one who's double checking everything. And even if you wrote some pieces of content somewhere in the beginning, when you give it a look with a fresh eye closer to the end, you might find things that may surprise you. So quality assurance and double checking things. You can never go too much with it. You can never go overboard with it, and just try to make sure that you have some time planned for that. Just because sometimes the typos and like wrong screens or something is glitching can be overwhelming and just crash your beautiful strategy and results that you want to put out there.
Yep.
I think it's one of the heads that content creators and writers usually have as one of their regular, like in addition to their regular role in general.
Mm. I'm looking at the chat, and Jennifer's mentioning that we have just 2 minutes to the next talk, but if you don't mind, I'll squeeze in maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We did have a couple from Ashley and Emily and Sunny. I don't think we'll get to all of them. But Sunny asked a question that I thought was interesting, is a little bit different from what we have been talking about so far in the Q&A. Sunny's asking about localization. I'm just trying to parse the question. Sunny says, the localization team plans their budget as well as for new content. I'm sorry, I'm probably not parsing correctly. Sunny's asking what kind of content information you think can be provided for localization budgeting as the content planner.
That's a good one as well, because you may not know from the get-go the amount that you'll be working with, but try to cover at least the basics of user-facing and internal content in terms of any guides, any how-to, any tutorials that you'll be putting out there, like all the basics that you think users might face, any basic troubleshooting content, any installation, how to start, any contact information, at least those basics should be covered and translated. Translated in terms of make sure you notify your localization team that that's the scope that you'll be working with moving forward. I think that's the good thing to start with.
Mm-hmm.
And feel free to ping me and follow up, and let's chat more about
awesome.
all the
Thank you.
pains and gains making content things happen.
Thanks for joining.
From planning to implementation.
Yay. I think Luke's talk is beginning. Luke is here in the chat. So I get people who want to start watching his talk. It's probably already streaming, but thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.